Yeah.
But essentially, that was the seeds of something I did as leader later on. It was a task force that traveled the state, held hearings, and came up with policy recommendations on workers' compensation. I ended up being appointed to the Labor Committee, and I go into this because even though we were in such a small minority, I had the opportunity in the first couple of terms to get deeply engaged in negotiation over workers' compensation and unemployment insurance reforms that the governor, Bill Milliken, was pushing for. And so those negotiations ultimately resulted in laws, and as frustrating as it was to be in the minority, I was engaged in policy making that was part of a majority agenda.
Well, did you feel that the Democratic majority in the House at that time, even though they could have just rolled over you and dismissed anything you said or thought because you were a minority Republican, that they really paid attention to you and that they did work with you?
They wouldn't have, but for Bill Milliken. Bill Milliken helped to drive the legislative agenda, and he, I think, helped create a climate in Lansing. It's not that we didn't have bitter partisan wars at times, but he did bring leaders from both sides of the aisle to the table and insisted on bipartisan policy making. And with Bill Ryan and Bobby Krim was Speaker when I first entered the House.
Right.
You had leadership and Bob Vander Laan in the Senate that worked comfortably together with our minority leadership.
Okay, so Bill Bryant is House Republican leader, I think, for your first 4 years. Then I think Mike Bush from Saginaw was the leader for the next 4 years. Did things change then? You had one election in 1984, which was pretty close.
Yes.
I think it was 57-53. There was an attempted coup by a maverick Democrat banding with Republicans.
Yeah.
Didn't quite work out. But what changed, if anything, there? Was it just pretty much more of the same with you all pretty much in a downtrodden minority?
Yeah. Mike, actually, you may recall that I actually ran against Mike for minority leader in 1984. And that was really about differences within our caucus that had emerged over reapportionment, redistricting, and kind of the frustration that we were not as proactive on policy, and there were a lot of budget deals being cut that were frustrating to a faction of the caucus. So while I would say Democrats and Republicans worked pretty well together, there were philosophical differences within the Republican Party about how the minority should behave.
Did you feel that your faction in the House Republican caucus wanted to be a little bit more aggressive against the Democrats than what Mike Bush was doing?
Yeah, it's the old divide that I don't know if it exists today still between kind of the appropriations part of the caucus, which was more interested in just getting budget deals done, and
spending
kind of
money.
the standing committee side of the policy committee side of the caucus that really was more interested in more aggressive policy making.
I got you.
The best thing that could have happened to me that I was defeated in that effort, because really my base of support was the more conservative faction of the caucus, and I don't think I would have been a comfortable leader had I defeated Mike.
Yeah. So then I think he decided to leave the legislature at the end of '86. You were elected leader, and you began a 6-year period when you were in the minority as the leader, but still without getting the majority. So what did you put in place? What happened between '86 and '92? And by the way, there was a momentous election in the middle of that, 1990, where John Engler came in as governor, defeating Jim Blanchard. What happened during that time?
That was actually a very fulfilling chapter for me, and I view the first part of my time in the legislature as an active committee member on Labor and Taxation Committee, and was a champion of sunset legislation, and so was very engaged in policy making. As a minority leader, my main goal was to rid our caucus of minority mentality, which is how I viewed our tendency, after being in the minority for so many years, a couple of decades, to simply feel comfortable opposing what the majority would propose, and not really have many ideas of our own that we stood for. And I give a lot of credit to Frank Fitzgerald, who was on our leadership team, and Vic Krause, who really initiated the idea when I first became leader of, let's set up a series of policy task forces. And it was Vic's idea to not just have the leadership say, here are the politically attractive issues that we ought to address. His idea was, let's get our very diverse caucus together, because we did have philosophical differences, hear from our members what are the policies, the vision for the state that excite them. And let's put their passions to work on these task forces. And that's what happened. And over that 6-year period, we had 24 task force reports with engaged Republican members pursuing what interested them. And the results sometimes surprised me greatly. When a group of members, including a number of our women members, said, we need to address child care, I thought, our caucus will never come together on child care policy. It would require more spending of money, philosophical difference over that. Instead, this group came together looking at best practices in the private sector, existing tax credits, and how can we promote child care in the state. And it brought the caucus together, and that's just one example where we stood for something. And while it was ultimately a reapportionment map that would allow us to win a majority, I'm convinced if we hadn't shed our minority mentality and started to act like a majority, we never would have gotten there.
Now, you got a lot of favorable publicity about those task forces too, while they were held. And as you say, without them, the only place that Republicans were meeting was always in committees with Democrats, where they were in the minority and didn't have the input that they did under your structure.
And the interesting thing, Bill, was that as we produced these reports, instead of just stewing about the fact that the bills that we would introduce would never get heard, our members started to go to work working with Democrats on amendments to their bills that started to make a difference. With our small numbers, we did start to have more of an impact on policy making when we didn't have the help of a Republican governor, because Jim Blanchard was governor for most of that period.
Let me ask you a couple of questions that could relate to the time we've just been discussing, from 78 to 92, or even thereafter. I'm just curious because it's come up recently in the Michigan legislature, particularly in the state house, and that is, number one, how was the issue of like 2/3 majority vote, immediate effect, handled in the House while you were there, whether you were in the minority or the majority? And that's very important, because one lever of power that the minority controls, you, the Republicans, is if you have greater than 1/3 of the membership of the House, you can stop any bill from getting immediate effect if you all hang together. And supposedly, the Constitution seems to demand a record roll call, if it's requested, by the minority or anybody, on immediate effect. Now, there's been a big controversy over that. I'm not going to go into it here, but how was this handled during the time you were in the House? Was there ever a question by either side, Republican, Democrat, majority, minority, that they were being steamrollered by the party that held the gavel in the Speaker's chair and wouldn't recognize them to have an immediate effect vote held and just gavelled some bill through?
As I recall, both when we were the minority and the majority, there were instances, not too many, where the minority would challenge immediate effect. And after being ignored a few times by the majority when the hands went up, as I recall, both we as a minority and the Democrats as a minority would circulate a list or a piece of paper, and people would sign their names and get it up to the clerk. And
did they have the paper all signed, ready to go? You had
Right.
to get it up pretty fast.
They'd have to get it up first,
Yeah.
and very fast. I think honestly, it didn't happen very often, but I think both sides, when they needed to get immediate effect, found
And
ways
it worked?
to.
It worked.
It worked sometimes, and other times I think it was ignored, or
You
it
mean
didn't
they'd
get.
lose the paper? They wouldn't
Right.
recognize the paper? Well, okay.
Yeah.
So,
It wasn't a hard and fit, but I don't think it's the issue that it is today. I don't think immediate effect as a tool was used. As I recall, some of the rule issues that we wanted to change when we became a majority, one, we were upset that the board would be held open so long, and we wanted to put a time limit on the board. We violated our own aspirations when we became majority, but there weren't many instances when we kept the board open longer than the 5 minutes.
I hate to say it's been violated many times since you were there. They've reverted to their old behavior. But you're basically saying the supposition of the majority in the chair on most questions of immediate effect was, we're going to give this bill immediate effect. And they would kind of gavel it through, and you would really have to work as a minority to get their attention. And if they wouldn't recognize your raised hands, you get the paper up there and hope that you can shame them into holding a vote.
Right.
So periodically it was an issue.
Yes.
What about speaking privileges on the floor? Were there instances over time, either Republican, Democrat, minority, majority, where people were muzzled? I mean, in the sense that the majority just would not recognize them, not just on an ad hoc basis, but maybe they didn't like the member, or maybe the member had said something that they thought was insulting and they were going to punish the member. There was even one representative who's now a lobbyist in Lansing who claims that back in 1996, he was told by the Democratic majority, this would have been 97, I guess, we will not recognize you again. He claims he was never recognized again the rest of the session. Did that kind of behavior happen when you were there?
No, I don't recall where we would have unwritten rules that certain members wouldn't be recognized. There were members that wanted to speak on almost every budget bill with many amendments, and that was as much a problem for us when we were a majority. We had a conservative faction that wanted to oppose our own budgets, and so we would tend to restrict the number of amendments they could speak to through informal agreement, but we never muzzled members. Probably the toughest speaker in my experience was Gary Owen, who
Democratic speaker between 82 and 88.
Yes, and when some of our more conservative members consistently opposed budgets and offered amendments, he, in fact, when Republicans were finally granted a second staff person in their offices, denied that second staff person to 3 or 4 of our members, and that was his way of muzzling.
Margaret O'Connor was one that I remember.
Tim Walberg.
Yes, I remember. Now Congressman Walberg.
Yes, right.